The fluorescent light above the metal table had been flickering for 11 minutes. Victoria Kane had counted every one of them. She sat with her hands flat on the table surface, fingers spread completely still. Not the stillness of someone waiting. The stillness of someone who had decided that stillness was the correct tactical response to the room she was in. There is a difference. Most people cannot tell what that difference looks like from the outside. The man sitting across from her could not tell. He had been talking for a while now. She had been listening with the part of her mind that recorded things without processing them, the way a camera records without understanding what it sees. His name was Major Carl Steele, intelligence insignia on his collar. Eyes that had learned to stay neutral, but hadn't quite mastered it. She put him at 42, maybe 43. Career military, the kind of officer who had learned to ask the right questions, but hadn't yet learned that the right questions sometimes closed doors you needed to keep open. He slid a photograph across the table. She looked at it. Desert terrain. The kind that exists in 3 different countries and looks identical in all of them. Vehicles burned to their frames, the metal warped outward like flowers opening in the wrong direction. Shapes on the ground covered with standard issue tarps. 7 visible in the frame. She knew without counting that there were 12. She had been the one who covered them. The fluorescent light flickered again. Steele leaned forward slightly. "We know who you are, Dr. Kane." He let that sit for a moment. "The question is, what you're really doing here." Victoria looked at the photograph for another 3 seconds. Long enough to be honest, short enough to stay controlled. Then she looked up at him. "Where do you want me to start?" She had been in rooms with that question before. The question that presents itself as open, but is actually a test. The answer you choose tells the questioner something about how much you understand of what they already know. Steele had spent 12 years in military intelligence, learning to read what people chose not to say. He would spend the next several hours learning that some people are better at that skill than he was, that the experience would change the way he thought about his work. He did not know that yet. She did. The light flickered again. She watched him process her answer and decide what it meant. She said, "Start with the mess hall, day 1. And she told him everything in the order it needed to be told while the fluorescent light held steady above them and the building ran its institutional course around them, and outside, somewhere on the base, it was still Tuesday morning, and the mess hall was still filling up, and the coffee was still burning on the burner, and the ordinary world continued without them. It had rained the night before she arrived. The kind of California coastal rain that doesn't commit to anything, just dampens the ground enough to make it smell different, to make familiar places feel slightly altered. The base had that quality of all large military installations, the sense of a world that had agreed on its own rules and then forgotten that other rules existed. Buildings in the same beige, roads in the same gray, signs in the same institutional font that someone had decided was the correct font for all serious information. She had parked in the civilian contractor lot, walked to the administrative building, checked in with a corporal who looked at her temporary badge, looked at her face, typed something into a computer, and handed back the badge without making eye contact. Standard. Expected. She had done this kind of entry 21 times in the past 7 years. Different bases, different names on the badge, different cover stories. But the corporal never looked up. They never did. The badge said Dr. Victoria Kane, civilian contractor, Psychological Services Division. It was not a lie exactly. She had the doctorate. She had done the clinical hours. She was a credentialed psychologist. She was also something else entirely. But the badge didn't have a field for that. The mess hall at Camp Pendleton in the morning is a specific kind of place. Anyone who has served knows what that means without needing it explained. The tables have an order that isn't posted anywhere and doesn't need to be. Rank finds its level the way water does. Senior NCOs near the windows. Junior officers in the middle section. Younger enlisted wherever they can fit, moving when they need to move, reading the room, the way their training has started to teach them to read everything constantly, automatically, with the low-grade vigilance that becomes a second skin in the first year of service. If you had walked into that mess hall on the morning of her first day and looked carefully, you would have seen the architecture of authority expressed entirely through proximity. Who sat closest to whom, who laughed first and who waited to laugh, who occupied the center of any conversation and who positioned themselves at the edge. She saw all of it in approximately 4 seconds. She picked up a tray, moved to the food line, took the eggs, the toast, the coffee, moved toward an empty table near the east wall. And that was the moment. He came from the left. She registered the movement before she registered the person, large, deliberate, the specific kind of walk that broadcast intention. Gunnery Sergeant Ray Briggs stood 6'2" and had the build of a man who had never in 15 years of military service allowed himself to become anything other than physically formidable. He was 41 years old, 3 combat deployments, a chest full of commendations, and an expression trained over 15 years to communicate one thing with absolute clarity. This is my territory, and you are in it. He stepped directly into her path. This is for Marines. His voice carried. That was intentional. 50 people in that room, and within 2 seconds, all of them were listening. Forks paused. Conversations dropped. The particular silence of 50 people choosing not to talk is louder than most sounds. She looked at him. I'm just here to eat. He stepped closer. A foot taller, shoulders squared. Everything about the geometry of him was constructed to make the space feel smaller, to make her feel the diminishment of it. You heard me, sweetheart. This isn't your building. Women like you don't belong in this building. You don't belong on this base. She did not step back. She had been in rooms with men like Ray Briggs before, not this man specifically, but this category of man. She understood the mechanics. The public performance of dominance requires an audience, and it requires a response. The expected response is retreat, shame, the physical communication of having been reduced. That response feeds the performance and validates the performer. It tells the room that the natural order has been demonstrated. She gave him none of it. She stood there holding her tray, and she waited. Something shifted in his expression. Not much. Just enough for someone paying very close attention to notice. He had expected the retreat. He had built the next 3 sentences around the retreat. Now he had to adjust, and adjustment is always a tell. He adjusted by escalating. His shoulder drove into hers. The impact was deliberate, controlled enough to be deniable, hard enough to accomplish its purpose. She went backward. Her tray left her hands the arc of it, following the physics of the moment. Mashed potatoes, coffee, a glass of water. All of it found the floor in the loud and messy way that scripted humiliations require. She hit the ground. Her palms caught concrete. The impact traveled up her forearms. The room erupted. Laughter has a texture in a large enclosed space. It bounces differently off metal surfaces than it does off fabric. It fills corners. It has no mercy in it. Someone threw a roll. It struck her shoulder. Another piece of food followed. Voices from 3 different directions. She stayed on the floor for exactly 3 seconds. Then she pressed her palms flat against the concrete and she got up. The way she did it is the thing that mattered. Not a scramble. Not the desperate recovery of someone trying to restore their dignity. Her core engaged. Her weight shifted forward. She came up in a single fluid motion that had no wasted movement in it whatsoever. The kind of movement that takes years. The kind that gets drilled into you through thousands of repetitions until your body does it without asking your brain for permission. She stood. She brushed food from her blouse. Left shoulder, right shoulder, front, methodical, precise. Then she looked at Ray Briggs. Her face showed nothing. Not humiliation, not anger, not fear. There was a quality to her expression that was difficult to name. Something like patience. The patience of someone operating on a timeline that the other person in the room cannot see. Are you done? 2 words. Quiet enough that the room had to go still to hear them. Briggs blinked. Just once, but she saw it. He recovered fast. Men like Briggs always recover fast. 15 years of command presence means you develop the ability to recalibrate in front of an audience without letting the audience see you recalibrate. He spread his arms wide, performed amusement for the room. The room responded the way rooms respond to that kind of performance. Laughter. The validation he needed. He said more things. She registered them without giving them weight. She turned and walked out. Her stride on the way to the exit was unhurried. She did not look at anyone. She did not look at Briggs. She pushed through the door and let it close behind her. 3 tables back from where it had happened, a young lieutenant named Declan Merrow sat with his fork still raised halfway to his mouth and watched the door for a long moment after she was gone. He was 28 years old, 6 years in, sharp enough to know when something didn't add up and experienced enough to know that the things that don't add up are usually the things worth understanding. The way she walked, he thought, that isn't how civilians move. He set down his fork. He didn't eat the rest of his breakfast. The social mathematics of a military base are not complicated, but they are thorough. What Gunnery Sergeant Ray Briggs had established in the mess hall on that first morning was not simply an incident. It was a policy, communicated without paperwork, without formal order, without anything that could be documented or reviewed. The kind of policy that travels through a closed community in hours and lands fully formed in the understanding of everyone who needs to understand it. By the following morning, the policy was in effect. When Victoria entered a room, people found reasons to leave it. Not obviously, not dramatically. They finished their conversations and moved on. They remembered something they needed to do. They developed a sudden interest in being somewhere else. The exits happened at the pace of normal routine, which made them effectively invisible. When she asked questions about procedures, about file access, about the scheduling of evaluations, she received answers. Single words mostly, complete in their technical accuracy and empty of any willingness to be useful. Yes, pending, unknown. She would need to check with someone else. That someone else would be unavailable. The files she needed would be processing. The processing would take an undetermined amount of time. She documented everything. Her notebook filled with observations written in a shorthand that looked standard and wasn't. Anyone reading over her shoulder would see the notations of a methodical psychologist managing a heavy caseload. What she was actually building was a map of who talked to who moved when someone else moved, who made things happen when Ray Briggs communicated in whatever indirect way he communicated that he wanted things to happen. It was a sophisticated operation for a mess hall bully, but Ray Briggs was not simply a mess hall bully. She had known that before she arrived. The 15 years, the 3 deployments, the commendations, those were real. The network of loyalty he had built was real. 15 years of favors creates infrastructure. Infrastructure is harder to dismantle than force. She ate standing by the wall at every meal. Never rushed, never looked at Briggs. She chose the spot just below the east windows where the morning light came in at an angle, and she ate her food methodically, and she watched the room without appearing to watch it, and she was doing exactly what she had come here to do, which was not, despite what her badge suggested, conducting psychological evaluations. At 6:45 every morning, before anyone else arrived at the psychological services office, she was at her desk. The office was small, government issue everything, a metal cabinet, 2 consultation chairs, a window that faced the parade ground where morning drills were already running, the sound of counted cadence rising and falling in the gray California air. She opened her laptop, connected to a network that was not the base network, ran a program that should not have existed on a contractor's machine. Lines of code she had written herself over 3 years, refined and tested again. Encrypted communication logs, routing data, the architecture of how information moved in and out of this installation. She worked for exactly 7 minutes. Then she closed the program, opened a standard evaluation template, adjusted her chair, folded her hands on the desk. When Private First Class Tyler Marsh arrived at 7:15 for his scheduled appointment, she looked exactly like what she was pretending to be. Marsh was 19. The particular kind of 19 that the military produces in its first year, physically transformed, psychologically still catching up. He sat across from her with the energy of someone who had been told to be somewhere and was uncomfortable about the reason. "I don't really know why I'm here," he said. "They just said I had to come." "That's fine, we can just talk." She was genuinely good at this. That was not performance. The doctorate was real, the clinical training was real, and the ability to make someone feel they were the most important person in a room, that was something she had been born with and then refined for specific professional purposes. She listened. She asked questions. She watched the small signals that bodies give when words are being managed, the shift of weight, the timing of breath, the way the eyes move when the mind is deciding what to leave out. Marsh talked about the adjustment, the gap between expectation and reality, the way military life had a shape he hadn't anticipated. And then, without prompting, he mentioned Briggs. The way soldiers mention certain names, not because they mean to, but because those names have accumulated enough gravity that they tend to emerge in conversation, the way heavy objects tend to find the lowest point in the room. Sergeant Briggs is kind of a legend around here. 15 years, 3 deployments. Everyone respects him. She asked her question the same way she asked it all her questions. Quietly, without leaning toward the answer. Respects him or fears him? Marsh stopped. 1 second, maybe 2. Both, I guess. She wrote something in her notebook, in the shorthand that wasn't standard shorthand. What she wrote was Marsh. Moment of hesitation. Distinction between respect and fear, visible and acknowledged. Not the first soldier to notice the difference. Probably not the last. After the session, she had 12 minutes before her next appointment. She used them to look at Ray Briggs' personnel file. The file was thick. Commendations, awards. 3 letters of recommendation from senior officers, each one glowing, each one specific about incidents and qualities. The record of a man who had performed his role with distinction over a long career. But there were gaps. Not many. She had learned over 7 years to look for what wasn't there rather than what was. Periods of deployment listed without location. Months in which the file went quiet in the specific way of something having been removed rather than nothing having happened. And then one notation, small, easy to overlook. A reference to an operational file. The text beside it was redacted black bars over the relevant content, but the name was still visible. Operation Hollow Mirror. The date beside it, 7 years ago. She looked at those words for a long time. Then she released the breath she had been holding, reopened her evaluation template, and waited for her next appointment. Lieutenant Declan Merrow made his mistake on the afternoon of the third day. He was the kind of officer who operated on the principle that incomplete information was more dangerous than uncomfortable information. It was a good principle. It had served him well. It led him on that Tuesday afternoon to sit down at a base administrative terminal log in with his contractor background check clearance and type in the name Kane Victoria. The system processed for 4 seconds. Then the screen went red. Not a standard access denial. Not the blue and gray formatting of a routine clearance block. Red, with text that appeared in capital letters in the center of the display. Access denied. Red Omega classified. Do not attempt again. Merrow sat back in his chair. In 6 years, he had processed contractor background checks on hundreds of individuals. The clearance system had a hierarchy he understood thoroughly. Standard, confidential, secret, top secret with various compartmented caveats. He had seen all of those. He had bumped against those walls and understood what they meant. He had never seen Red Omega. He had never even heard of Red Omega. He read the last 4 words again, do not attempt again. He thought about what kind of classification requires a warning. He logged out, stood at the window for a moment looking at the parade ground, at the afternoon drills winding down, at the ordinary machinery of military life running its ordinary course. Then he went to find her. She was at her desk. Late afternoon, the last appointment of the day finished. She looked up with the specific expression of a professional interrupted during focus of work. Perfectly calibrated. He almost missed it. But he was watching her hands when she closed the folder. The grip, index and middle finger at a specific angle. He had seen that grip before on the range on people who handled weapons seriously and often. He closed the door, lowered his voice. He asked her directly, who was she? What did the file mean? What was Red Omega? She looked at him for a moment. The look was an evaluation. He had enough experience to recognize being assessed even when the person assessing was very good at not appearing to do it. Then she said, you have a flag on your record right now, Lieutenant. The system logged your access attempt. Whoever monitors Red Omega classifications knows you tried. He felt the information land. I didn't consider that. I know. He looked at his hands, then back at her. What does it mean, the classification? She stood, walked to the window. When she spoke again, her voice was quiet enough that he had to pay attention. It means you should be very careful about which doors you open. Some doors, once you try them, don't close again for you. She turned to face him. You seem like a good officer. Observant. Willing to question things that don't fit. Those are not common qualities. Don't waste them. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have for you right now. She pushed a printed communication log across the desk. A copy of something from Briggs's file routing data she had identified in her first week. 3 transmission nodes flagged in her encrypted program. Ghost addresses with no legitimate designation in the base network architecture. Look at these destination codes, she said. He studied the page, his brow tightened. These routing addresses don't match any standard format I recognize. They're not standard. Where do they go? She let a moment pass before she answered. It was not a hesitation. It was a decision being made. That's what I'm here to find out. He looked up from the page. The thing behind his eyes was the look of a person arriving at the edge of something large, feeling the size of it without being able to see the full shape. She took the page back. She straightened it. She placed it in the folder. Goodbye, Lieutenant. I'd suggest you forget this conversation happened. He left. She waited until the sound of his footsteps had faded. Then she turned back to the window and let herself think about what was coming. She reached into her bag, found the small metal case, opened it. The challenge coin was warm from being next to her. It was always warm. She had carried it for 7 years through 21 separate field deployments, through 6 different cover identities, through 2 surgeries and 1 extraction, and 14 months during which the United States military had listed her as killed in action. She turned it over. The back was worn smooth in the center from years of her thumb finding the same path. The emblem on the front was a unit designation that didn't appear in any public record or database with external network access. Below the emblem SG-12, she held it and looked at the parade ground and said their names. Not out loud. Inside, the way you say things that have been said so many times they don't require sound anymore. Holloway, Merritt, Beaumont, Falconer, and 8 more after those. All 12, in the order she had learned them. 7 years. The thread that had begun in the rubble had led here, to this base, to a file with a redacted reference, to a gunnery sergeant with gaps in his record and a network built from 15 years of knowing what people needed and what they feared. She put the coin back in the case back in the bag. Tomorrow she had 9 appointments. She began to review the files. The badge stopped working on the morning of the 4th day. She discovered it at the main gate at 6:40, the same time she arrived every morning. The MP ran it twice. The reader blinked red both times. He looked at the badge, then at her with the expression of someone who has been told what to say and is now saying it. System error, he told her. She would need a new one issued. She asked how long that would take. He said it depended on how busy admin was. She nodded. She thanked him. She walked to the processing area near the main gate and took a seat on the bench provided for visitors awaiting clearance. She sat there for 6 hours. She had brought her notebook. She used the time well. What she was mapping was not simply a record of petty harassment. It was the anatomy of a network. The badge had not failed due to a system error. System errors don't happen to one person with one badge on one specific morning. What had happened was a decision communicated through a chain of people, each of whom had done their small part without needing to understand the whole. One person made a call, another person made an entry, a third person delivered the system error line with a straight face. None of them individually had done anything documentable as targeted. That was the sophistication of it. When her replacement badge finally arrived at 2:40 in the afternoon, the clearance level had been quietly downgraded. The North Wing was no longer accessible to her. The sector containing senior staff offices in the Secure Communications Center now required a clearance tier above what she had been issued. Another system error, the admin clerk explained. She accepted the badge, said thank you, walked back to her office and opened a blank page in her notebook and wrote one sentence. Then she closed the notebook and began reviewing files for the next day's appointments. Her evaluation report, 7 days of careful, thorough psychological assessments, came back marked insufficient documentation. New requirements had been issued by command. She would need to reformat everything. When she asked for the updated criteria in writing, the request entered a process that would take an undetermined number of business days to complete. She began reformatting. She discovered that her access to the psychological evaluation database had been revoked while she was doing it. Without the database, no reports could be filed at all. She sat back in her chair and looked at the parade ground through the window. The morning drill was finishing. The cadence count drifted up through the glass, muffled and rhythmic, a sound that had probably traveled through this window every morning for decades. The trap was geometric. Each new constraint closed one more angle. Every resource removed meant one more avenue that led nowhere. The message was clear: leave voluntarily or be made to leave by the accumulation of impossibility. There was a knock at her door. Declan Merrow entered. He closed the door behind him. He looked like a man who had spent several days thinking about something and had arrived at the threshold of saying it out loud. He sat down. He placed his phone on the desk face up. She looked at the screen, the access log from his search. The red-bordered denial. The classification return. I've been in the military for 6 years, he said. I've run background checks on roughly 200 contractors. I have seen every standard clearance level in the system. I have never seen this one. He tapped the screen. I spent 3 days trying to find a reference to it in any public-facing documentation. There is no public-facing documentation. You have a flag on your file from the original search. You know that. Yes, he met her eyes. I know. She studied him. He was listening to understand rather than respond. That was not a common thing. She pushed the communication log across the desk. The 3 ghost address nodes from Briggs's file. The routing data that went nowhere legitimate. Look at the destination codes. He studied the page. These don't match any standard format I recognize. They're not standard. They're designed to look like routing errors, noise in the system, the kind of thing that gets logged and forgotten. He looked up from the page. Something was clicking into place behind his eyes. But they're not errors. No. A long moment. Then this isn't about Briggs. She looked at him carefully. Briggs is a mechanism, she said. What I need to find is who built the machine. She took the page back. She folded her hands on the desk. You're a good officer, Merrow. Be careful about what you do with that. He left. She listened to his footsteps fade down the corridor. Then she turned to the window and let herself think. The planted evidence arrived on the morning of the 6th day. She came back to her quarters after her last appointment to find the mattress overturned, her clothes distributed across the floor, her personal items spread across the desk in the careful disorder of a search designed to look accidental, and on the desk, placed exactly where it would be impossible not to see, a small plastic bag. 3 pills. 2 MPs were waiting in the corridor. She looked at the bag. She processed the geometry of it, its placement, its visibility, the quality of the staging. Then she saved the documents she had been working on, closed her laptop, and went with them. The interrogation room was designed to make the person sitting in it feel the disadvantage of their position. She had sat in rooms like this before from both sides of the table. She answered every question with the same measured precision. Her story contained no inconsistencies because it was not a story. It was an account of what had not happened, and what had not happened has the structural integrity of actual truth. After 4 hours, Major Carl Steele entered. She had been waiting for him in a specific sense. Not this man, but this event. When standard pressure fails to produce expected results, institutions send their more sophisticated instruments. Steele was the more sophisticated instrument. He sat down. He did not open a folder. He simply looked at her for a long moment in the way of someone who finds that skill useful and occasionally burdensome. "Your background check is interesting," he said. "Most civilian contractors have clean linear files: education, employment, professional references. Yours has gaps. When I tried to verify your previous work against the clearance records, they're supposed to correspond to I hit walls. Not classified material that I'm used to. Walls that shouldn't exist for a psychology consultant." She said, "I can't speak to how your verification systems work, Major." "No." He stood, walked toward the door, paused. "The contraband charges are going to be dropped. The witnesses can't agree on what they saw." A pause. Someone was careless about covering their tracks. He left without waiting for a response. The charges were dropped within the hour. She was escorted back to her quarters. She stood in the room with the overturned mattress and the scattered clothes, and she did not move to fix any of it immediately. She thought about what Steele's appearance meant, what his awareness of the walls in her file meant, whether his disclosure of that information was a warning, an alliance, or something more complicated than either. She filed him under unknown, monitor. Then she righted the mattress, folded her clothes, arranged her desk. That night she could not sleep. This was not unusual. She had learned to take sleep when it came and not to fight its absence when it didn't. On the nights it didn't come, she used the time. She sat on the edge of her bed and opened the metal case. The coin was warm as always. She turned it over in her fingers and let herself go back, which was something she did only when she was alone, and the night was quiet enough to contain it. The location had no designation on any map that ran through standard channels. A compound in terrain that looked like 3 different countries. They had been there 11 days, 12 of them conducting observation of a target that required human eyes rather than satellite coverage. She was senior field officer. The night was clear, no wind. The first impact came at 23:14. She knew from the accuracy and the interval that it was coordinated. You learn over time to distinguish between engagement and execution. Engagement has a searching quality. The first round's looking for range adjusting. Execution doesn't search. It knows exactly where it's going. 13 minutes. She counted them later, reconstructing the timeline from forensic data. In 13 minutes, all 12 positions had been hit, all 12. She came back to consciousness in the rubble at 23:41. She knew the time from her watch, which was still running. She knew her ribs from the constrained quality of her breathing, 3 of them, though one might have been a fracture rather than a full break. The shoulder she knew from the warmth and weight of blood under clothing. She lay still for 47 seconds, listening. No movement. The silence of conclusion. She pressed her palms flat against the rubble and she got up. The extraction point was 2 miles northeast. She oriented by stars. The overcast was partial enough, sky visible for navigation. She did not think about the 2 miles. She focused on the next step, and then the one after that, and then the one after that, the way her training had taught her, and the way this particular night required. 2 miles is a distance that generates despair. Steps are manageable. Steps are countable. Steps move you forward, whether or not you can see where forward ends. She reached the extraction point at 01:19. The medic moved toward her with his kit. She held up her good hand. Not yet. "Who ran communications relay tonight?" He said her name, her actual name. He said she needed to sit down. "Who ran communications relay?" Not a question the second time. The first word of a sentence she had just committed to finishing. 7 years of finishing it. 21 field assignments, each one a thread followed as far as it would go, and then dropped at the point where it disappeared into something larger. Building the picture from the outside in because the center was protected and the protection was sophisticated and the people providing it had stars on their shoulders and the kind of institutional authority that made most methods of inquiry close before they opened. But threads followed long enough connect. This one had led here. She put the coin back in the case, closed it, opened her laptop, ran the program for 7 minutes, recorded what she found, closed it. She lay down and closed her eyes and counted her breath until morning came. The tribunal was convened on the morning of the 8th day. The summons was official. High priority designation. She was required to appear before a full investigative panel at 1300 hours. All evidence would be presented. A final determination would be made regarding her continued presence on the installation. She read it twice. Then she set it on her desk and went to make coffee. She spent the morning finishing her 11 outstanding evaluation reports, not because they would matter to the outcome of the tribunal, but because she had told these soldiers she would complete their assessments, and she intended to. She was thorough. Her clinical observations were accurate. Her recommendations were sound. At 1100 she stopped, changed into a fresh blouse. Dark navy, professional. She looked at her reflection in the small mirror above the sink and held the reflection's gaze for a moment. Then she reached into her bag and took out a case she had not opened since her first morning on the base. She didn't put it on, not yet. She held it in her palm and felt its weight. Her real identification, the one that corresponded to her real file. She put it in her jacket pocket. The hearing room was larger than the interrogation room. Elevated platform for the panel, institutional lighting. Colonel Susan Harker presided from the center of the platform, flanked by Major Steele on her right and a JAG officer on her left. The seating area held 47 people by her count. In the front row, with the specific posture of a man who has arranged his comfort with care, sat Ray Briggs. He was not smiling. He didn't need to smile. The architecture of what was happening was sufficient. Victoria sat at the defendant's table, alone, no advocate, no representative. Colonel Harker calls the tribunal to order. Major Steele rose. He spent 31 minutes presenting the case against Victoria Kane. He was precise and professional. The documentation was thorough. The access log anomalies were presented with technical clarity. The witness statements were organized chronologically. He was good at his job. She watched him work and noted the places where his presentation had been shaped by information it was unlikely he had gathered independently. When he sat down, Colonel Harker looked at her. The defendant may present her defense. Victoria stood. She looked at the panel. She looked at Steele. She looked at the 47 faces and at Briggs in the front row with his particular quality of contained satisfaction. "Before I begin," she said, "I have a procedural question. Are all relevant parties present? Everyone involved in the investigation?" Harker frowned. "The relevant officers are present. Why do you ask?" "Because I want to make sure that when the truth becomes visible, everyone who needs to understand it is in this room." The quality of the room's silence shifted. Briggs's expression did not change, but something behind it changed. She registered it. "I've been called a security risk, an infiltrator, a civilian who accessed areas she had no right to access." She reached for the collar of her blouse. "Those accusations aren't entirely wrong." She rolled up her left sleeve, past the wrist, past the forearm, and there on the inner surface of her arm in black ink that had been there for 9 years was a tattoo. Not decorative, an emblem. The kind that doesn't appear in any publicly available registry of military unit insignia. The kind that requires a specific clearance level even to encounter in reference materials. Below the emblem in clean institutional font SG-12, Ray Briggs went the color of concrete. The JAG officer on the panel opened his mouth. Harker put a hand up without looking at him. Steele was very still. The room was completely silent for 3 full seconds. Then the doors at the back of the hearing room opened. They came in formation, 4 of them. The particular formation of senior officers moving with deliberate purpose, each one carrying the gravitational weight that 4 stars on a shoulder produces in a military setting. The room did not need to be told to stand. The room stood. General Margaret Doyle, General Stokes, General Brandt, General Walter Croft. They walked the length of the center aisle in silence. Every person in the room watched. They reached the front of the room. They turned to face Victoria Kane. And in perfect unison, they raised their hands in salute. Not to the panel, not to the room, to her. The sound the room made was not quite silence and not quite breath. It was the sound of 47 people recalibrating simultaneously. In the front row, Ray Briggs did not move. He appeared for the first time since she had known him to have run completely out of responses. General Doyle's voice when she spoke was clear and carried without effort to every corner of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, Commander Victoria Kane, SG-12 Joint Special Reconnaissance Group, Red Omega clearance level. Every person present in this room, including each of us, operates within the scope of her authority on this matter." Victoria returned the salute. At ease, she looked at Harker. The charges were manufactured by someone in this room with sufficient institutional leverage to move the administrative machinery of this base against a single individual. "I will let the documentation speak for itself." She set a folder on the panel table. "My work here is not yet complete. I'll need several more days to finish it. Harker looked at the folder, looked at Victoria. Of course, Commander, the tribunal is dismissed. Ray Briggs sat in the front row very still looking at the floor. He was transferred to a holding facility within the hour. She came to see him at 1600. The room was concrete and institutional. He sat at the metal table without cuffs because she had specified that he be treated according to his rank pending investigation. She gave him a moment to collect himself. When his breathing had steadied, she said, I need to ask you some questions. You can answer them here now with me, or you can wait for the formal process, which will take longer and be considerably less comfortable. He looked at the folder she placed between them. Routing data, ghost addresses, clearance codes embedded in transmission protocols. I want to tell you, he said, and stopped. Then, I want to tell you that I didn't know what I was relaying. That's true, I didn't know the content. He looked at his hands. But I knew the addresses weren't standard. I asked once, and the answer was clear enough that I didn't ask again. Who gave you the addresses? He searched the room, the door, the walls, the ceiling, looking for permission or protection or a version of this moment where the answer didn't cost what it was going to cost. He found none of those things. Someone with clearance codes, he said barely above a whisper. The level you don't get below a certain rank. How certain? He met her eyes. General, he said. The room felt different after that word. She held it where it landed and kept her expression exactly where it was. You're telling me your handler has general rank. I'm telling you the codes they used when they contacted me could only come from that level. I never saw a face, not once in 7 years. She looked at him for a long moment. The man who had shoved her to the ground in the mess hall, who had marshaled an entire base against her. Looking at him now, she saw what she had suspected from the first day. Ray Briggs was not a conspirator. He was a mechanism, used because he was useful, maintained because he was controllable, expendable the moment he stopped being either. He had been a pawn. He had also caused real harm. Both things were true, and neither canceled the other. She closed the folder. One more question. The 4 officers who entered that hearing room today. She watched his face carefully. The clearance codes you received, could they have come from any of them? He said nothing for a moment. The nothing had a shape. I can't say which one. I never knew which one. He swallowed. But yes, the codes, the protocols, the level of access. He paused. Yes. She stood. She walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame. She thought about 4 generals standing in a row saluting her. About which of those faces had shown in the moment after the salute the specific quality of calm that didn't fit the moment. The calm of someone who had decided the situation was still manageable. She walked out into the late afternoon light. Somewhere on this base, one of the 4 people who had saluted her this morning was the thread she had been following for 7 years. She had one night to find out which one. She spent the night building the case, not the emotional case. She had carried that for 7 years and it required no further construction. What she built through the hours between midnight and 4 in the morning was the evidentiary architecture, the arrangement of documented facts in the specific sequence that would leave no structural gaps, no interpretive spaces large enough for a man with resources and decades of institutional standing to move through. She worked at her desk with the encrypted program running in one window, and her notation files in another, cross-referencing financial data against personnel records, against communication logs, against the operational timeline of Hollow Mirror, as she had reconstructed it over 7 years. 4 names, 4 generals. She needed to eliminate 3 of them. General Stokes she addressed at 2200 hours. She went to him directly. No summons, no intermediary. She knocked on the door of his quarters and waited. He opened it with the expression of a man who had been expecting a knock and was not surprised by the timing. That told her something. She showed him 2 documents, the specific financial thread she had traced from the offshore structure she'd been analyzing and a communication intercept from 18 months prior that connected the same network to a procurement irregularity on a different installation. Stokes looked at the documents for a long time. Then he looked at her. You think it's me, he said. I think it might be you. I'm here to find out. What followed was 40 minutes of conversation that strips away the layers professional environments require and arrives at what is actually true. Stokes had been managing an arrangement with a defense contractor for 3 years. It was illegal. It was self-serving. It had nothing to do with foreign intelligence, with Hollow Mirror, with Ghostline, or with the deaths of 12 people in a location with no name. He was hiding something. He was hiding the wrong thing. You need to disclose that arrangement, she told him. It will end my career. Yes, that's the cost of the choice you made. She paused at the door. For what it's worth, you're not the person I'm looking for tonight. She had left and moved to the next name. General Brandt had cooperated with her quiet inquiry in the way of a man with nothing to hide and considerable anxiety about being near someone who was looking. His file was clean in the specific way of someone who had never been near enough to the interesting decisions to get contaminated by them. General Doyle she had assessed from the beginning as the most likely ally and the least likely suspect. The anger she had shown in the hearing room when complexity arose was the anger of someone who had invested 30 years of genuine service in an institution and was confronting what it might have harbored. That anger was not performed, which left General Walter Croft, 61 years old, 32 years of distinguished service. Intelligence background, he had spent his formative career years in the professional environment where presenting an unreadable face was a survival skill. 3 graduate degrees, including a doctorate in strategic communications from an institution whose alumni roster read like a directory of people who went on to make consequential decisions in rooms without windows. He had been the intelligence liaison for Hollow Mirror, not one of several, the liaison, the single point through which operational intelligence about that mission had passed before reaching command level. The person who had known with precision exactly what assets were where and when and why. He had personally recommended Ray Briggs for the communications relay position. She found the trust fund at 2:47 in the morning. Registered in Delaware, the trustee was a law firm that existed primarily as an address. The beneficial interest was designated to a minor identified in the filing as W. Croft Jr., Walter Croft's son, 11 years old, who would inherit the fund on his 25th birthday. The capitalization of the fund traced through 4 shell companies across 3 jurisdictions. She followed the thread for 40 minutes. It disappeared into an offshore structure designed to be opaque and largely succeeding. But at the 3rd layer, she found a holding company whose incorporation documents listed a single director, a name she had encountered 18 months ago during an assignment that had seemed at the time unrelated to Hollow Mirror. It was not unrelated. She sat back in her chair and looked at what she had built. Outside the window, the parade ground was dark and empty. The base slept with the particular efficiency of people whose lives ran on mandated schedules. At 4 in the morning, she left her quarters. She was gone for 2 hours. When she returned, she made coffee, sat at her desk, and waited for the day to begin. She sent the meeting request at 700 hours. 4 names: Secure Conference Room Building 12. 1100 hours. The message carried the authentication code corresponding to her actual clearance level. The generals would understand upon seeing it that this was not optional. They arrived within 3 minutes of each other. Doyle first, then Stokes, then Brandt, then Croft. They filed into the room and took seats around the conference table and looked at her with the expressions of people who have been summoned rather than invited. No staff, no aides, no recording equipment beyond what she had placed in the room herself before they arrived. She stood at the head of the table. She began with Hollow Mirror, not with accusations, with facts, the operational timeline, the communication architecture, the window during which the coordinates of 12 assets had traveled from a classified intelligence file to the hands of people who had used them with lethal accuracy. She laid it out the way a builder lays a foundation, methodically level by level, checking each course before placing the next. Doyle was very still, the stillness of someone absorbing a blow and deciding whether it would knock them down. Stokes looked at the table with the expression of a man counting what he was willing to acknowledge. Brandt looked like someone whose understanding of a period of his own professional life was being reorganized in real time. Croft looked at the table's surface, not at her, not at the documents, at the surface itself with the expression of a man waiting for something to be over. Patient, remote, slightly above the proceedings if you didn't know what you were looking for. She knew what she was looking for. She placed the communication logs on the table. Briggs's routing data, the 3 ghost addresses, the clearance codes embedded in the transmission protocols codes that required a specific authorization level to generate. She placed the trust fund documentation. She watched Croft's hands as she set it down. Nothing moved, no adjustment of posture, no shift of weight, but his eyes went to the document for exactly half a second before returning to the table. She had what she needed. She said, "Someone at this table authorized the transmission of classified operational coordinates during Hollow Mirror. The codes used to generate those transmissions trace to this level of command. The financial instrument in front of you connects to a funding network that traces through 4 layers of corporate structure to a foreign intelligence entity that has been active in targeting American military operations for at least a decade." Doyle's voice was tight and controlled. "Victoria, what are you saying?" "I'm saying 12 people died because someone sold their position. I'm saying the thread from that sale leads here." She looked at Croft directly for the first time. "General Croft, you were the intelligence liaison for Hollow Mirror. You had singular access to the operational coordinates. You personally placed Sergeant Ray Briggs in the communications relay position with full knowledge of his financial vulnerabilities. Croft looked up from the table. He met her eyes. For a moment, nothing changed. Then the quality of his expression shifted. Small. The kind that only happens when someone decides there is no longer a purpose to maintenance. A professional mask releasing tension it had been holding for a very long time. He said, "You're smarter than your father was." The room temperature didn't change. The lights didn't flicker. The building kept running on its institutional momentum, indifferent to what was happening inside this room. Victoria did not move. He was good, Croft continued. 20 years ago, he had the financial thread. He had 2 of the source documents. He was close. A pause. Not close enough. She said the road. Mountain highway. No guardrail on the east side of the second curve. He said it with the flatness of someone describing a logistical detail from a project completed long ago. He drove that road twice a week. It was a matter of timing. She was 12 years old when her father didn't come home. She remembered the sound the telephone made. She remembered standing in the kitchen doorway, watching her mother's face change. She remembered the quality of light afternoon light through the west window, golden, the kind she had never subsequently encountered without something tightening in her chest. She had suspected. She had kept the suspicion in a compartment where she stored things that required control before they could be processed. Suspicion and confirmation are different weights, and she felt the difference land now somewhere below the professional composure, somewhere she would deal with later when this was finished. She said, "The network, ghost line, how long?" "I was recruited in my 3rd year. They were patient. They don't rush the acquisition of assets at this level." Something moved in his face that was not quite pride and not quite shame. They were very good. And hollow mirror. The operation represented a risk to a particular element of their infrastructure. The assets were too close to something that needed to stay unexamined. He looked at her with the attention of someone who has decided the performance is over and is for the first time entirely direct. 12 was the number required to neutralize the risk. You were meant to be in that number. She held his gaze. "I know," she said. He reached into his jacket. Doyle moved to rise. Stokes pushed back from the table. Victoria held up one hand, palm out. "It won't work." Croft's hand emerged holding a detonator, small, matte black. He held it with the steadiness of a man who had made peace with what he was about to do. "This room has been prepared," he said, 3 years ago. A reasonable precaution for a meeting space used by senior command. His thumb rested on the trigger. A gas accumulation event. Tragic. The kind of accident that happens in older buildings with aging infrastructure. 5 casualties at this level would be devastating, of course. He looked at her. But manageable. She said, "Press it." He pressed it. Nothing happened. The room made no sound. The building continued its institutional hum. The lights burned steady. Croft looked at the device. Pressed again. Again. Victoria said, "I was in this room at 4 this morning. The devices in the ventilation system were well placed. The work is professional. I'll grant them that. It took me 40 minutes to locate all 4 and another 20 to disable them without leaving evidence of the disabling." She watched the last calculation move through his face. The accounting of resources and options and available responses. The moment when a man who has operated on the premise of his own superior positioning confronts the fact that the position is gone, he dropped the detonator. He came across the table. He was 6 feet and 220 pounds in 32 years of physical conditioning, and the force in him now was the compressed force of a man who has spent 3 decades controlling a secret and is watching the control end. He moved with the speed of someone who has trained for this kind of moment and believes that speed and size are sufficient advantages. She was already moving when he cleared the table. She had been ready since he reached into his jacket. The readiness was not visible. She had learned over years of this kind of work that visible readiness, telegraphs and telegraphing costs you the half-second that determines outcomes. She had sat at the head of the table appearing to present her case while maintaining the quality of full-body attention that her training had made automatic. She let his momentum commit. He drove forward. She dropped her weight, redirected the force of him along a vector he hadn't chosen, used his own speed the way you use a current, not against it, but with it taking it somewhere he hadn't intended to go. She had run this specific sequence of movements 10,000 times. Not this situation. These movements against this category of resistance with this weight distribution and this kind of committed forward momentum. They hit the wall together. His elbow came at her face. She rolled under it, closed the distance, found his wrist. The joint has a compliance point that exists in every human body regardless of conditioning. She found it and applied the principle, and his wrist went where physics required it to go, and his body followed because That is what bodies do. The floor. She had her knee in the space between his shoulder blades before he had processed that he was down. His arm was at an angle behind him that was sustainable only if he remained still. He was still. She was breathing, controlled even, the way she had been trained and the way 7 years had refined and the way this specific moment had been building toward, through every repetition. Every night she had not slept, every step she had counted in the dark on a 2-mile walk with 3 broken ribs and a bullet in her shoulder. She said, "General Walter Croft, you are under arrest for treason, espionage, conspiracy to commit murder, and the deliberate targeting of United States military personnel in an active field operation." His breathing was ragged against the floor. "You have the right to remain silent. I'd suggest you use it." The door opened. Impod Pease entered. She had positioned them in the corridor before the meeting began. They moved to the prisoner with the efficiency of people executing a briefed instruction. Croft was cuffed and raised to his feet. He looked at her once as they turned him toward the door. The mask was gone entirely. What was underneath was not defiance. It was something more complicated. The face of a man looking at the end of a very long road and finding that it looks different from what he had imagined. She said nothing. He was taken out. In the room, no one spoke for a long moment. Doyle was standing hands flat on the table holding something very tightly because the alternative was letting it collapse. Stokes and Brandt looked at each other and then at Victoria with the expression of people reorienting around a reality that has just been substantially revised. Doyle said, "Walter." Just the name, just the weight of it. Victoria said, "He wasn't wrong about one thing. Ghostline is a network, not a person. Taking him removes the leadership layer, but the infrastructure below it is still active. We have work to do." She picked up her folder. "I'll need access to his complete files. Every communication, every contact, every decision he touched in the past 20 years. Your cooperation determines how quickly we can close what remains open." Doyle looked at her. The tightness in her face had not resolved, but the steel behind it had. "You have it. Everything. Whatever you need." "I know," Victoria said. "I've always had it." She picked up her bag and walked out. 20 minutes later, Major Carl Steele found her in the corridor. He stood in the way of men who have reassessed something fundamental and are still working through the reassessment. He had spent the past 11 days as an instrument of a process he had believed was legitimate. He was the kind of officer who needed to believe the processes he served were legitimate. Finding out they were not was costing him something visible. She waited. He said, "I owe you an apology. You did your job. The problem wasn't your job. The problem was who was directing it. I should have seen it. Yes, but you also pulled the contraband charges when the evidence didn't hold. That mattered." She looked at him directly. "The question going forward is what you do with what you know now. That's the only question that counts." He held her gaze for a moment. Something in his expression settled, not resolved, but settled the way a foundation settles when it finds level ground. "Whatever you need for what comes next," he said. "I'm cleared for most of what you'll be working with, and I'm good at finding things that are designed not to be found." She studied him. 12 years in military intelligence. The particular quality of a man who had just decided to stop operating on assumption and start operating on evidence. She thought about the walls he had mentioned hitting when verifying her file. The kind of walls that a person of his experience and competence recognizes as significant. The kind that once noticed become impossible to forget. "I'll be in touch, Major," she said. She left him in the corridor. Behind her, she heard him take a breath. Then his footsteps moved in the opposite direction toward the secure communications center, toward the work that needed to begin. The next 72 hours moved with the specific momentum of institutional consequence. Croft's files were opened, his communications were decrypted by a team that worked in 12-hour rotations and found at each new layer evidence that extended the scope of what they were dealing with further than the previous layer had suggested. 15 years of active intelligence compromise, deployment plans, strategic assessments, operational timelines, personnel files of assets in the field whose covers had been quietly burned by information that had passed through Croft's hands. 43 deaths in the preliminary accounting that traced with varying degrees of directness to information he had provided. 12 of them in a location with no name on any official map in 13 minutes 7 years ago. The network below him began to surface. Some of it surfaced because his arrest had severed the command structure, and the secondary nodes didn't have contingency protocols sufficient for a decapitation event at that level. Some of it surfaced because people who had operated under his protection suddenly found that protection gone and made the calculation that cooperation produced better outcomes than continuation. Ray Briggs' cooperation was complete. He had come to the holding facility on his own. No summons, no escort. He had walked to the duty officer, stated his name and rank, and said that he had additional information to provide and wanted to provide it. The duty officer had called the contact number on file, and Victoria had arrived within 20 minutes. He sat across from her in the same room where she had questioned him before. The cuffs were gone. He looked like a man who had put down something very heavy after carrying it for a long time. The exhaustion was not physical. He talked for 4 hours. Names, dates, drop locations, communication protocols, the architecture of how instructions arrived, and how the system had been designed to keep each participant isolated from the others, visible only to the level above them, never to the network as a whole. When he finished, she closed her notebook. He said, "What happens to me now? A tribunal will make that determination. Your cooperation will be documented in the official record. I'll advocate for consideration of the circumstances." She looked at him directly. "That's what I can promise. I won't promise more than I can deliver." He nodded. He looked at his hands. "I knew somewhere back that what I was doing was wrong. Not the particulars, I didn't know the particulars for most of it, but the shape of it, the quality of what it felt like to do it." He paused. "I told myself things that made it possible to keep going. Everyone does that." "Yes. Does it get better? The knowing." She thought about the honest answer. "You learn to carry it differently," she said. "That's not the same as better, but it's something." He stood when she stood. He straightened to his full height, the instinct of military bearing, too deeply trained to be overridden even now. He extended his hand. She shook it. "Prove me right, Sergeant." He said, "Yes, ma'am." She walked out into the afternoon. The mess hall on the last evening was the same building it had always been. Same beige walls, same institutional lighting, same smell of coffee burning on the burner it always burned on. The same sounds of a large group of people in the particular social mathematics of a shared meal. When she pushed through the door, the room shifted. Not dramatically, not with announcement. It moved the way a body of water moves when something enters it, a spreading adjustment, starting at the point of her entry and radiating outward until the whole room had reconfigured around her presence. People stood. Not because they had been told to, not because a command had been issued, but because rooms know things about how to respond to certain moments, and this room knew. 50 people on their feet, and the sound of the room went quiet, and what replaced it was the quality of silence that is not the absence of respect, but the presence of it. She walked to the food line. She took what she wanted. The room watched her, and she let it watch the way she had let it watch on every day she had been here, without acknowledgement, without performance, without giving the watching anything to feed on. She moved to the center of the room the way water finds its level, without announcing itself, without asking permission. She walked to the table where Ray Briggs had held court every morning for years. The center of the room's power geography, the seat he had occupied as a territorial statement. She pulled out the chair. She sat down. She put her tray on the table and looked up at the room. They were still standing. At ease. They sat. The room resumed its ambient sound conversations, restarting with the slightly different quality of people aware of being in a moment they will remember. She picked up her fork. Across the room, she saw Declan Merrow. He stood a moment longer than everyone else, not out of formality, but the look of someone completing a thought they'd been developing for 11 days. Then he picked up his tray and walked across the room and sat down across from her. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. They ate. Outside the windows, the parade ground ran its late afternoon drill, the cadence count drifting up through the glass, rhythmic and steady, the sound of something that continues regardless of what happens around it. After a while, Merrow said, "You knew the whole time how it was going to end." She thought about that, about what knowing means when you're standing in the middle of something, able to see the shape of it, but not the specific weight. "I knew what I was looking for," she said. "I didn't know everything I was going to find." He understood the difference. She could tell by the way he received it. She finished her food. She drank her coffee. She returned her tray. She walked to the door. "Commander," she turned. Merrow was still at the table looking at her. "Whatever comes next, when the time is right." He met her eyes. "I meant what I said. I'll be ready." She looked at him for a moment. This young officer with sharp eyes and the kind of conviction that doesn't require an audience, the kind that had watched a room celebrate cruelty and chosen quietly to sit separate from it. Not dramatic, not announced, just the daily practice of being the person he had decided to be. "I know you will," she said. She walked out through the door she had first walked through 11 days ago. She did not look back. The room was finished. What came next was ahead of her. The vehicle was waiting in the civilian contractor lot. She got in. She placed her bag on the seat beside her. She opened her laptop. The connection established in 9 seconds. The encrypted program ran its authentication sequence. A file appeared on the screen, red-bordered classification markings she recognized immediately. Hollow Mirror Phase 2. She had first seen this designation in the files recovered from Croft's encrypted archive. Phase 1 had been the placement of assets within military intelligence structures, the long, patient work of positioning people and resources across a network broad enough to survive the loss of individual nodes. That work had been underway for more than a decade. Phase 2 was something else. The file was partially decrypted, enough to read the structure of what it described, enough to see the coordinates, a different installation, larger, more sensitive, deeper in the command infrastructure of the American military apparatus. Enough to see the timeline, which was not theoretical, which had a date, which was soon. She looked at the coordinates for a long moment. She had spent 7 years learning to read the architecture of things like this, the particular grammar of operations designed to be invisible from the outside. What she was reading now was not the end of something, it was the middle. Croft had been a significant node, but the network he had served had not built itself around any single point of failure. They were too sophisticated for that, too patient, too old. She opened a message window on the encrypted channel. She typed an authentication code. She typed en route, ETA 6 hours. She closed the laptop. The vehicle moved through the base gate. The MP waved them through. She did not look at the base as they drove away from it. She looked forward at the road at the California afternoon, flattening toward evening, the light going gold and long across the landscape, the way it does when it's finishing for the day. She thought about her father. She let herself think about him directly for the first time in years, not the compartmentalized version, not the controlled and managed memory, but the actual man. His voice. The particular way he laughed, which was a quiet thing, more breath than sound. The hands that had shown her when she was 9 years old how to read a compass. Find north, he had said, not as a destination, as a practice. You orient yourself, then you move. The destination changes. The practice doesn't. He had found the thread 20 years ago. He had followed it as far as he could. She had followed it the rest of the way. It was not enough. She knew that. It would never be completely enough because some losses do not have enough on the other side of them. But she had learned over 7 years the specific difference between enough and finished. And what she had done was real, and real things matter, even when they don't resolve everything. The vehicle reached the highway. The base receded in the mirror. She opened the laptop again, pulled up the coordinates for Phase 2, and began the process of preparation the way she always began it, working through what she knew and identifying what she needed to learn. Somewhere behind her in a server room in Building 7 at Camp Pendleton, a technician was running routine maintenance on a network diagnostic system. A notification appeared on his screen, an automated flag, an access event on a restricted archive file. The file was labeled Hollow Mirror Classified Archive. The access had originated from a terminal in Building 4. He picked up his phone to report the anomaly. The lights went out. 3 seconds. Standard emergency lighting kicked in, then the main power resumed. He looked at his screen. The notification was gone. The access log showed nothing. The file displayed a last access timestamp from 6 weeks prior, which was not what the flag had indicated 45 seconds ago. He navigated through the system for a moment, cross-checking the log files. Clean. All of it. He sat back. He looked at his screen for a moment longer. Then he shrugged in the way that people shrug when the institutional explanation available to them is that systems sometimes do things and there is no percentage in pursuing what the system says didn't happen. He returned to his maintenance routine. Somewhere in the architecture of the network, a process that had run its sequence and closed without leaving a signature had transmitted a forward message to an address that would not appear on any network diagram in any publicly accessible documentation. The message read, SG-12 has left base. In a location that existed in no official registry, in a room with no windows, and equipment that did not appear on any procurement manifest, someone read those 4 words on a screen and made a call on a phone that was not a phone anyone else knew existed. The call lasted less than 30 seconds. When it ended, the person who had made it looked at a map covering most of the wall, markers at several locations across the continental United States. One marker at a base in California was removed. A new marker was placed further east. On the highway heading northeast, Victoria Kane looked at her coordinates and thought about what her father had told her with a compass when she was 9 years old. How orientation is not a destination, but a practice. You find north, you adjust, you move. The destination changes. The practice doesn't. She had been listed as killed in action for 14 months. She had spent 7 years becoming a ghost. She had learned to move through institutions without being visible, to follow threads, without announcing herself, to wait with the patience that most people cannot sustain. What she had done here mattered. She had also learned over 7 years that the work does not conclude. It continues. The specific threat changes and the specific network adapts, and the specific faces change, but the work itself is work of following the thread, of maintaining the patience, of pressing your palms flat against the concrete floor and standing with your shoulders back and asking if they are done. That work does not finish. She understood that. She had made her peace with it. The vehicle drove on. The California evening settled into dark. The road ahead was clear and straight for as far as she could see, and beyond the visible distance, where the road curved into what she could not yet see, the next thread was waiting. She had always known that justice does not sleep. She had stopped sleeping before it did.